Lucas, lucky Mercer, never wanted to be special. He just wanted to make it through the day without inadvertently setting something on fire or summoning a small storm at the wrong moment. It was bad enough that he couldn't even sneeze without causing a mild earthquake. Most people could only dream of having the kind of powers Lucas had, although, honestly, he'd trade them for a good night's sleep without worrying if he was about to cause an avalanche while making dinner. It started when he was a kid, small, strange incidents. At age 7, Lucas had pulled a glass of water off the table in a fit of frustration, but instead of spilling it, the water had frozen midair. The same year, a minor argument with his dad led to a gust of wind that knocked over a neighbor's garden gnome, just one of those little quirks that made life interesting in all the wrong ways. By the time he was an adult, Lucas had learned to hide his abilities. Keeping them under wraps was a full-time job in itself. Lucas worked at Zeta Tech, a mid-sized startup that specialized in cloud computing solutions and IoT devices. It wasn't glamorous, but it kept him busy, and more importantly, no one there had the faintest clue about his strange talents. He was a model employee, mostly because he had perfected the art of pretending to be boring. He didn't need any attention on him. Not now, not ever, but one Tuesday, everything changed. It started like any other day. Lucas sat at his desk, typing away at a code that needed to be finished before 5 p.m. He was focused, zoning out to the hum of his dual monitors when it happened. A mild headache started to creep in, which wasn't uncommon, but this time, something felt different. A warmth spread over his fingertips. The kind of warmth that always preceded trouble. He sighed, rubbing his temples, hoping it would go away. Instead, his desk began to tremble. No big deal. Just a little earthquake. But it wasn't an earthquake. No, it was something far worse. A small flame erupted on his desk. A tiny, contained flame, but a flame nonetheless. Not now, Lucas muttered under his breath. He smothered it with a handful of napkins. Fortunately, there was a coffee spill that quickly absorbed the fire, but now he was left with wet napkins and a small scorch mark on the desk. Lucas, a voice called from behind. His heart sank. It was Maggie, the office manager. She'd seen it. The fire, you okay? Maggie asked, her brow furrowed. Lucas smiled weakly. Yeah, just, it happens. Sometimes I get distracted. Don't worry about it. Right, Maggie said, giving him an unconvinced glance. If you need to take a break, just let me know. Thanks, but I'm good. Really? Lucas's face felt like it was burning. He prayed she'd leave, but Maggie didn't leave. She stood there for a second longer, as if considering something. Then, with a final, suspicious look, she turned and walked away. Thank God, Lucas muttered to himself, wiping his forehead with his sleeve. He was sweating now. A gentle breeze whistled through the office, an office with no open windows. That night, things took a turn for the worse. Lucas had barely finished dinner when the knock came at the door. 3 sharp raps, loud enough to rattle the whole apartment. It wasn't the delivery guy. Lucas didn't order anything. He hesitated for a moment before opening the door. Standing in front of him was a man in a dark suit, his face unreadable, his hair perfectly combed. Mr. Mercer, the man said, his voice low and clipped. I'm Agent Harris. I represent N-Corp Industries. We need to talk. I'm sorry, but I don't know what this is about, Lucas replied, trying to close the door. But Harris's hand shot out, stopping it. Please, Harris said. We don't want to make this difficult. But we've been watching you for a long time. That was when it hit him. The strange events in his life, the unexplainable powers, the way things always seemed to go wrong whenever he was too stressed out. All of it. He'd been tracked. Who are you? What do you want? Lucas demanded, his voice shaking. We're interested in your abilities, Mr. Mercer, Harris replied, his gaze unwavering. We know about your unique powers. And we believe you're the key to something much larger. Please, step inside. Lucas had no choice. Before he knew it, he was in a blacked-out van speeding through the night, unable to ask more questions. The man had told him nothing, only that they needed to extract information from him. Hours later, they arrived at a massive, cold-looking facility. It was tucked away in an industrial park, the kind of place you'd expect to find either a secret weapons lab or a forgotten warehouse. This, Lucas quickly realized, was the former. Inside, he was ushered into a sterile, white room, where an intimidating figure waited. The man, dressed in a military uniform with a series of stars pinned to his shoulders, didn't waste any time. His eyes were sharp, calculating. "Mr. Mercer," the general began. "I'm General Thorne. You're going to help us change the world." Lucas stood frozen in place, his mind racing. "Help them change the world, General? I don't even know what's going on. What do you want from me?" he asked, still shaken from the shock of the night. Thorne smiled, a cold, dangerous smile that made Lucas's skin crawl. "I've known about you for a long time, Mr. Mercer. Your powers, your genetic code, are exactly what we need." "My genetic code?" Lucas repeated, confused. "Your abilities are not random, Mr. Mercer. They are encoded in your DNA. We've been studying it for years." Thorne stood up and walked to a nearby table, where a series of papers and high-tech devices were laid out. "This, Mr. Mercer, is what we've been working on. We've successfully replicated your elemental abilities into a new generation of soldiers who have full control over these powers." Lucas's heart dropped. "You've cloned me?" "Yes," Thorne replied, his voice calm. "But it's not just cloning. It's the future of warfare. With these abilities, we will reshape the world. The military will be unstoppable, and we will establish a new world order, one where peace and control reign. And you, Mr. Mercer, are the cornerstone of it all." Lucas could barely process the words. Soldiers with his powers? The idea was terrifying, absurd. They were creating an army, a superpowered army, based on his own weaknesses and failures. "You can't do this," Lucas said, his voice trembling. "You don't understand. I can't even control my powers. They're random." Thorne looked at him with pity. "That's the beauty of it. We've taken your genetic material and perfected it. These soldiers, my soldiers, will control your powers. And you, Mr. Mercer, will help us take the next step." And just like that, Lucas was caught in something much larger than himself. Something that began with his unpredictable, uncontrollable powers and had now spiraled into a nightmare. As the soldiers began to march, each one wielding the same powers as him, Lucas realized there was no turning back. He was the key to their plan. And if he couldn't find a way to stop them, the world would soon be under the rule of a ruthless, genetically enhanced army. He had to stop them, but how? Lucas spent the next few days in a haze, a blur of sterile rooms, endless tests, and cold, calculating eyes. He was no longer a person, he was a specimen, a subject. They studied him, probed his genetic code, and subjected him to humiliating drills meant to trigger his powers. But none of it was real. None of it was him. They could replicate his powers all they wanted, but they couldn't understand the unpredictable, chaotic nature of them. General Thorne and his team might have engineered soldiers with more control, but they didn't have the essence of what Lucas had. They didn't have the random bursts of elemental power that could turn a coffee cup into a deadly weapon 1 minute, and a gentle breeze the next. They didn't know the fear that came with never being sure if your hands were going to burst into flames when you were just trying to make dinner, but it was clear that Thorne didn't care about Lucas's struggles. He cared about the results, his perfect army of elemental soldiers. He'd already gone too far. The soldiers, each a perfect replica of Lucas's powers, were being trained in secret, with missions lined up to unleash terror on the world. This wasn't just about control anymore, it was about power. And control, to Thorne, was the most dangerous weapon of all. Lucas had to get out of here. He had to stop them. But how? It was at night, when the facility was quiet, that Lucas found his chance. He'd been pretending to comply with their demands, going through the motions, learning how to control the powers they'd cloned from him. But in truth, he hadn't been trying to master anything. Instead, he'd been watching, waiting. He knew the schedule of the guards, the blind spots in their security system, the exact times when the lights would flicker on and off, little glitches that would give him the opening he needed. He'd been preparing for this. As the facility's automated alarms clicked off, signaling the midnight hour, Lucas made his move. He slipped out of the cramped lab he had been kept in and ducked into the shadows. His breath quickened as he navigated the darkened hallways, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know where he was going, but he didn't need to. He needed to get out. To break free. In one of the hallways, a door slid open, revealing a heavily armed soldier standing guard. Lucas froze, his mind racing. There was no time to hide. He couldn't run without being caught. But then, as he glanced around, he noticed something, a row of metallic pipes running along the ceiling. Without thinking, he raised his hand, and with a thought, he willed the air to move. A gust of wind swirled, pushing him off the ground just enough to give him the height to reach the pipes. The soldier didn't notice as Lucas used the wind to lift himself, almost weightless, and silently darted into a ventilation shaft. It was far from graceful. His powers, still unpredictable, flared up and fizzled out, but it was enough to get him out of immediate danger. He moved through the air ducts, holding his breath and praying the wind didn't turn into a hurricane on accident. Hours passed, or maybe it was minutes. Time was hard to measure when your life was hanging by a thread. Eventually, he heard voices below, growing louder. They were searching for him. He had to act fast. He reached a maintenance hatch and pried it open. The fresh air hit him like a shock. He was outside, free for the first time in days. But the world outside didn't look the way he remembered it. The sky, once clear and blue, now seemed tainted with a strange haze. A faint hum of electricity buzzed in the air, like static, and the streets were eerily silent. His heart sank. What had they done? He stumbled through the darkened streets, unsure of where to go. It was nearly impossible to tell what was real anymore. Had he been gone for days? Weeks? The city around him seemed so different. Desolate, even. He didn't have the answers, but there was one thing he did know: Thorn had unleashed his soldiers. His army of elemental beings, armed with the same unpredictable powers he himself possessed, was out there, doing their bidding. The first sign of their presence came a few blocks away. It wasn't much, just a flicker in the air, like a heat wave. But then, he heard it. A sharp crackling noise, followed by the unmistakable sound of wind tearing through the streets. He turned in time to see a soldier, one of the clones, floating above the ground, their hands glowing with an eerie blue light. Lucas's blood ran cold. They were everywhere. The soldier spotted him instantly. Their gaze locked, and the air around them vibrated with an invisible force. "You're not supposed to be here," the soldier said, their voice distorted, metallic, like a bad radio transmission. Lucas didn't have time to think. He reacted instinctively, raising his hands. The wind swirled around him, but it was weak, sluggish, like a breeze that couldn't make up its mind. It wasn't enough to stop the soldier, but it was enough to throw them off balance. The soldier's eyes narrowed. "You think you can escape?" they sneered. Lucas didn't respond. He couldn't. His powers were too unpredictable. But he had to fight back. He had no choice. In a panic, he gathered what little strength he could muster and shot a blast of air directly at the soldier. The soldier countered with a gust of wind so fierce it knocked Lucas to the ground. For a moment, everything went black. When he came to, he found himself lying on a cold metal surface, a burning sensation running through his limbs. His powers were back to their chaotic, erratic nature. He had to focus. He couldn't let them win. "You're wasting your time," the soldier's voice echoed in his mind. "There's nowhere to run. Nowhere to hide." Lucas's pulse throbbed in his temples. They were right. They were everywhere. There was no escape, but then, something clicked. The wind. The power. The element he knew better than anyone. He focused, even as the air around him crackled with static. Slowly, he raised his hands again, and this time, something was different. The wind didn't feel chaotic anymore. It felt controlled. The soldier lunged toward him with a cry of rage, but Lucas was faster. With a snap of his fingers, the wind snapped back like a whip, sending the soldier crashing into a nearby building. For a moment, the world was still, and then, Lucas heard it, voices. The unmistakable sounds of more soldiers approaching. He couldn't take them all on. Not like this. He was outnumbered, and his powers were still unpredictable. But for the first time, he felt a spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he could beat them. He ran through the streets, dodging their attacks, using his powers to manipulate the elements around him, earth, wind, water, fire, each one a weapon, each one a gamble. He didn't know what would happen next, but he had no choice but to keep fighting. Somewhere in the back of his mind, a thought nagged at him: I need to find a way to shut them down. These soldiers, his clones, were too strong. Too powerful. If he didn't stop them, they would destroy everything. He needed a plan. He needed to find the key to their power and take it away from them. But how? The city was no longer familiar. It was a battleground, a place torn apart by forces Lucas barely understood. The buildings, once towering symbols of progress, now stood like broken monuments to a world on the brink of destruction. As he darted through the streets, avoiding blasts of fire and gusts of wind sent in his direction by the soldiers chasing him, he couldn't help but think of how quickly everything had changed. But the time for thinking was over. He needed to act. The sound of marching boots grew louder. He could hear the soldiers coming, their footsteps synchronized, as if they had been trained to hunt him down with military precision. They knew what he could do. They knew the power they wielded. And soon, they would trap him. They would end this. His breath came in short, ragged bursts as he sprinted down an alleyway, trying to lose them. His powers were still in flux, unpredictable, and weak when he needed them most. He could barely summon enough wind to keep himself from falling, let alone fight off a squad of super soldiers. He had no plan, no backup. He was alone. But then, in the chaos of his flight, a flicker of an idea came to him. The soldiers were replicas of his powers, yes, but they were also programmed. Engineered, in a sense, to be perfect soldiers. They were given all his strengths, but none of his weaknesses. None of the unpredictability that made his powers so dangerous, so human. He couldn't outfight them, not directly. But if there was one thing Lucas understood, it was that chaos could never be tamed. And that was where his power lay. It wasn't in precision or control. It was in the moments when the elements themselves broke free from all the rules they were supposed to obey. As he turned a corner, he spotted a familiar sight, an old warehouse, one he used to pass by when he worked at Zeta Tech. It was a relic from the past, a place that had been abandoned long before N-Corp's rise to power. And as Lucas ran toward it, he realized it might just be the one place the soldiers wouldn't expect him to go. Without thinking, he ducked inside, pulling the heavy door shut behind him. It was dark and damp inside, the air thick with the smell of mildew and rust. The kind of place you'd expect to find old machinery or forgotten memories. But to Lucas, it was a sanctuary, at least, for the time being. He pressed his back to the wall, trying to catch his breath. His heart was still pounding in his chest, and the tremor in his hands told him his powers were dangerously close to spiraling out of control. He had to focus. Had to think, and that's when he remembered Dr. Elena Vasquez. He'd met her only briefly, back at the N-Corp facility, when she'd offered to help him. She had been one of the few scientists at the company who'd seemed to understand that something was terribly wrong with what they were doing. She had talked about a kill switch in the soldiers' genetic code, something embedded in their DNA that could be activated by someone with the same genetic signature. And that someone, Lucas realized, was him. If he could find Elena, he might be able to end this madness. But how could he even find her now? N-Corp had locked down every communication channel. And with soldiers hunting him in every corner of the city, it felt like a hopeless task. Then, out of the corner of his eye, something caught his attention, a faint glow coming from the back of the warehouse. Lucas froze. It wasn't much, just a sliver of light coming from beneath a metal door. But it was enough. He moved toward it cautiously, his heart hammering in his chest. He wasn't sure what he would find on the other side, but he knew he couldn't wait any longer. The door creaked open with a groan of protest, revealing a small, dimly lit room. A series of computer terminals were arranged in a circle, their screens flickering with images and data Lucas couldn't quite make sense of. At the center of the room, seated in front of a large, dusty monitor, was a figure he recognized instantly. Dr. Vasquez? Lucas asked, his voice a mixture of relief and disbelief. She didn't look up at first, her fingers flying across the keyboard with practiced precision. When she finally did, she gave him a tired, wary smile. "I was wondering when you'd show up," she said dryly. "I didn't know where else to go," Lucas replied, his voice shaking. Sit down," she interrupted, motioning to the chair beside her. "We don't have time to talk. They're looking for you." "I know," Lucas muttered, collapsing into the seat. "I've been running from them all night. I can't hide forever." Elena nodded, her gaze steady. "You're not supposed to be hiding. You need to stop them." "Stop who?" Lucas asked, his head spinning. "I don't even know what's happening anymore. Thorne's army, those soldiers, what did he do to them?" "They're the culmination of everything Thorne's been working toward," Elena said, typing furiously as she spoke. "He's using your genetic code to create an army of superpowered soldiers, each one more dangerous than the last. But there's a flaw in their design. A flaw that you can exploit." "A flaw?" Lucas repeated, confused. "How? I'm just a mess of chaos. I can't control my powers. What makes you think I can stop them?" Elena turned to him then, her eyes locked onto his with an intensity that made his breath catch. "Because you're not just a source of elemental power, Lucas. You're the key. Their genetic code is based on yours, but they've altered it. They've made them stronger, more predictable, but in doing so, they've removed the one thing that gives your powers their unpredictability. They've removed the chaos." Lucas frowned. "So, what? You want me to bring back the chaos?" Elena's smile was grim. "Exactly." The more she explained, the clearer it became. The kill switch wasn't a simple off button. It wasn't a matter of pressing a key or pulling a lever. The soldiers' powers were tethered to their genetic code in a way that made them predictable, stable. But if Lucas could tap into the raw chaos of his powers, the parts that even he could barely control, it might break the genetic bond, destabilizing the soldiers and rendering their powers useless. The plan was dangerous. It was risky. But it was the only chance they had. Minutes later, they were back on the move. Elena had outfitted Lucas with a small device, a tracker that would allow him to locate the central server controlling the soldiers' genetic data. He didn't understand half of what she said about it, but he trusted her. The warehouse door slammed behind them as they stepped back into the night. Lucas's mind raced. The soldiers were still out there, still searching for him. He couldn't afford to be caught. Not now. Not when they were so close. As they approached the heart of N-Corp's operations, the tension in the air grew palpable. Lucas could feel it in his bones. The wind shifted, almost like it was waiting for him to do something. He didn't know what it was, but something deep inside him was stirring. He could feel the power building in his chest. The chaos was close, closer than it had ever been before. Elena led him down a narrow alley, her eyes darting nervously around. The soldiers could be anywhere. Then they saw them. A group of super soldiers, standing in the middle of the street. They were scanning the area, their faces cold and expressionless, but there was something about them that sent a chill down Lucas's spine. It was a trap. They'd found him. One of the soldiers looked up and locked eyes with him. There was no hesitation, no moment of realization. They simply attacked. Lucas didn't think. He reacted. He raised his hands, feeling the wind swirl around him, lifting him off the ground. But this time, it wasn't a weak gust. It was powerful. The air thickened, charged with energy. The chaos was here. Lucas pushed harder. The wind turned into a howling force, ripping through the streets. The soldier nearest to him raised his hand to block the blast, but it was no use. The gust knocked him backward, sending him crashing into the side of a building. The others tried to retaliate, but their powers, neat, controlled, and precise, couldn't match the wild force of Lucas's elemental chaos. He wasn't just fighting them anymore. He was tearing through the very fabric of their control. But it wasn't enough. More soldiers arrived, surrounding him. He could feel the pressure mounting, the weight of their presence closing in. Elena grabbed his arm. "We need to move, now." He didn't argue. With a final surge of power, Lucas whipped his hand toward the ground, summoning an earthquake that rattled the entire street. The soldiers were thrown off balance. That was his opening. He ran. The server was close. The chaos was close. They found the central control facility just as the sun began to rise. It was hidden beneath the city, buried in the deepest levels of N-Corp's headquarters. Inside, Lucas reached into the depths of his power and unleashed the full force of his elemental chaos. The genetic bond broke. The soldiers screamed in agony as their powers unraveled, destabilizing their very existence. The control center collapsed. And with it, the army that Thorn had built. Lucas's powers didn't stop. They were out of control. But in that moment, Lucas didn't care. He had won. The world, it seemed, had been torn apart by his chaos, but now, it was his to rebuild.